You know that feeling. You're spiraling, overthinking every text, replaying the last conversation, wondering if you said too much or not enough. You sense them pulling away, and your instinct is to pull them back. Call them, fix it, prove you're worth staying for. But here's what you're not told. When you act on that anxious impulse, you don't bring them closer. You confirm their fear that closeness means chaos. You reinforce their story that intimacy equals pressure. Now let me show you what happens when you do the opposite. When instead of grabbing on, you get still. When instead of chasing, you reconnect with your value. That silence, that pause, it echoes. And suddenly, the person who is running now feels your absence. They notice the space they created and they start to question it. Because now, they're not sure if you'll still be there when they return. That's when avoidants begin to feel what they couldn't see before. They realize the quality of your presence. They remember the connection. Not as suffocating, but as safe. But here's the magic. This only happens when you stop trying to prove your worth to someone who hasn't earned it. You become magnetic the moment you stop begging to be seen and start seeing yourself. When someone with an anxious attachment style senses distance in a relationship, their entire system lights up. It's not just a thought, it's a flood of emotion, a primal urgency to fix, to restore connection, to do something. That urgency often manifests as reaching out, checking in more frequently, over-explaining feelings, or trying to decode the other person's behavior. The anxious mind is looking for relief, not just emotionally, but physically. There's a visceral discomfort that comes with feeling emotionally unsafe or uncertain, and that discomfort demands resolution. The problem is, the methods used to soothe that discomfort often have the opposite effect. Anxious individuals tend to seek closeness when they feel afraid, which is natural for their system, but becomes a challenge when the person on the other end is avoidantly attached. For the avoidant, the anxious person's attempts to get closer during emotional tension can feel overwhelming, invasive, or even controlling. The more the anxious person tries to repair the bond through words, actions, or even presence, the more the avoidant feels the need to protect their space. And what do? They pull away, they withdraw emotionally, they retreat into silence, distance, or distraction. This dynamic plays out in countless relationships. One person moving in to feel secure, the other pulling back to feel free. The emotional overexposure that happens when the anxious person reacts in real time to that distance is often misunderstood. From their perspective, they're fighting for the relationship, trying to maintain connection. But from the avoidance lens, it can feel like pressure, like they're being asked to give more when they're already feeling overwhelmed. It's not that the anxious person is wrong for wanting closeness, it's that the timing and intensity of that need don't align with the avoidant's tolerance for emotional engagement. This misalignment creates a feedback loop. The more the anxious partner expresses, the more the avoidant shuts down. The more the avoidant shuts down, the more the anxious partner expresses. And it becomes a spiral. What makes this dynamic especially painful is that both people are trying to protect themselves, but in ways that are completely opposite. The anxious partner is protecting themselves by reaching in, by closing the distance. They believe that if they can just communicate how they feel, if they can just get the other person to talk or stay or respond, they'll feel secure again. Meanwhile, the avoidant is protecting themselves by creating emotional space. They believe that if they don't take that step back, they'll lose their sense of autonomy or feel consumed by someone else's needs. These two protection strategies clash, not because either person is malicious, but because their nervous systems are wired differently. When an anxious person doesn't recognize this dynamic, they end up overexposing themselves emotionally. They might share too much too soon, or they might try to compensate for the lack of reassurance by pouring even more energy into the relationship. They begin doing the emotional labor for both people, checking in, initiating conversations, planning meetups, trying to guess what the other person needs. This overfunctioning doesn't just create exhaustion, it slowly erodes their self-worth. They start tying their value to how the other person responds. If they get a text back, they feel validated. If they don't, they spiral. They confuse someone else's emotional distance with a personal failure, when in reality, it's not about their worth at all. It's about a difference in how they process intimacy. This is where the anxious person loses sight of their own boundaries. They become so focused on re-establishing connection that they stop asking if the connection is mutual. They stop observing the other person's capacity and willingness to meet them halfway. Instead of stepping back and evaluating the relationship, they become hyper-focused on fixing it. And in doing so, they unintentionally hand over all their emotional power to someone who might not even be equipped to hold it. Stillness and space from the anxious side interrupts the pattern and commands attention. For someone with an anxious attachment style, this concept can feel completely unnatural. When tension arises or there's perceived distance in a relationship, the instinct is to act. Text first, apologize, even when you're not sure what went wrong. Ask if everything's okay. Send another message just to clarify your last one. The driving force behind all of this is a desire to close the gap, to restore harmony, to make sure the connection is still intact. But what often gets overlooked is that this instinctive reaction doesn't actually repair the bond in the long term. It just soothes the anxiety temporarily. And worse, it often pushes the avoidant partner even further away. Avoidantly attached individuals respond very differently to emotional intensity. Where the anxious person finds security in closeness, the avoidant finds security in space. So when emotional intensity rises, when the anxious partner leans in with urgency, heightened emotion, or a flurry of messages, it can feel to the avoidant like a wave crashing over them. Their instinct is to get away from that intensity, not out of cruelty, but because their nervous system experiences that pressure as overwhelming. So while the anxious partner thinks they're fixing the problem, they're often feeding it. This is where stillness becomes powerful. Stillness isn't silence for the sake of silence, and it's not passive aggressiveness. It's a conscious shift from reactive to reflective. It means choosing not to respond immediately to your emotional discomfort. It means recognizing that your urge to reach out might not actually serve the connection. It might just serve your anxiety. And when you learn to sit with that discomfort rather than act on it, something shifts. You begin to reclaim your emotional center. You stop outsourcing your peace of mind to how someone else responds or doesn't respond. Now, here's where the dynamic truly begins to change. When the anxious person stops overfunctioning and introduces space into the connection, it disrupts the avoidant's expectations. The avoidant is used to the pattern. They pull back, the anxious partner leans in harder. This confirms the avoidant's unconscious belief that closeness equals pressure. But when the anxious person does something different, when they step back, get quiet, self-soothe instead of seek, they interrupt the narrative. Suddenly, the avoidant isn't being chased. They're not being asked for more. They're left with space they thought they wanted, but that space starts to feel different. Without the pressure of pursuit, they're now left with room to feel, to notice, to reflect. In this stillness, the avoidant has the opportunity to process the connection on their own terms. They're not being emotionally chased or managed. They're given the freedom to come toward the relationship rather than feeling forced to stay in it. And ironically, that freedom is what can awaken their desire to re-engage. When someone stops trying to prove their worth or earn attention, they shift the dynamic. They create an energetic pause that commands attention, not because it's manipulative, but because it's unfamiliar and powerful. The stillness isn't just about what it signals to the avoidant, it's about what it builds in the anxious person. That pause creates space for inner growth. It's a moment where they can start asking different questions. Am I reacting or am I responding? Am I trying to connect or am I trying to control? Am I honoring my needs or am I bending to keep the peace? These questions create awareness, and awareness builds strength. That strength, when practiced, becomes quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't chase love but attracts it. And while the anxious person might still feel the internal pull to fix, call, or clarify, choosing stillness over impulse becomes an act of self-respect. It's not withdrawal, it's intentional grounding. It's the decision to let the relationship breathe instead of suffocating it with fear-based action. Avoidants recognize value not through pressure, but through absence and emotional boundaries. This is something that can feel counterintuitive to someone with an anxious attachment style. When you care deeply about someone, your instinct is often to give more, to show up more, to make your presence felt in ways that reassure the other person of your commitment and loyalty. But with avoidantly attached individuals, that type of emotional closeness, especially when it comes too quickly or too intensely, doesn't always feel safe. To them, it can feel like a threat to their autonomy, a signal that they might lose their sense of self within the relationship. So when they feel overwhelmed or pressured, their instinct is to retreat. Not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to feel emotionally safe while staying connected at the same time. This is why so many anxious avoidant dynamics end up locked in a painful loop. The more the anxious person expresses, the more the avoidant shuts down. The more the avoidant shuts down, the more the anxious person ramps up their effort, their emotion, their need to reconnect. And this reinforces a core fear in both people. For the anxious person, the fear is abandonment. For the avoidant, the fear is engulfment. Both are trying to protect themselves, but in completely opposite ways. And when this push-pull dynamic becomes the norm, neither person feels seen, valued, or emotionally safe. But what breaks this cycle isn't more effort. It's not more explaining, more proving, or more availability. What shifts the dynamic, what genuinely gets the avoidant to see the anxious partner in a different light, is space. It's the absence of that predictable emotional chase. It's when the anxious partner stops trying to close the gap and starts respecting their own emotional boundaries that something changes. Because suddenly the avoidant isn't being pursued. They're not being asked to manage someone else's emotions. They're not being called to respond under pressure. They're given the thing they value most, space. But in that space, something unexpected happens. They start to feel the absence, not just of the person, but of the dynamic they've come to rely on. And that absence carries weight. When the anxious person establishes emotional boundaries, not in a punitive or manipulative way, but from a place of self-respect, they redefine how they show up in the connection. They stop explaining themselves over and over again. They stop reaching out when communication isn't reciprocated. They stop saying yes when their heart is screaming no. They begin to value their own emotional energy. They protect their peace. And in doing so, they stop handing out their presence like a free sample, because their time, their attention, their love actually means something. This shift doesn't go unnoticed. Avoidantly attached people may not articulate their emotions easily, but they feel the difference when the dynamic changes. When someone who used to overextend suddenly becomes grounded and emotionally contained, it disrupts the avoidant's expectations. It creates space for the avoidant to notice the connection in a new way, on their terms, without the emotional pressure they typically associate with intimacy. They begin to feel what it's like to miss that person, to wonder, to reflect. That quiet space becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, the avoidant starts to see the value of what they had, because now it's not chasing them, it's simply gone. Not gone in a vengeful or dramatic way, but in a grounded, self-respecting way that says, I know what I bring and I won't deplete myself to convince you. The truth is, people don't always recognize value when it's right in front of them, especially avoidance. They recognize it when it's no longer emotionally overavailable, when there's a shift in energy, in tone, in the way someone carries themselves. Boundaries, for the avoidant, don't push them away. They help them feel safe. They remove the pressure. They create emotional clarity. And in that clarity, the avoidant can start to feel what was drowned out before: their own longing, their own appreciation, their own connection to the person they once needed space from. The most attractive thing anxious people can do is master self-soothing, not pursuit. When someone is anxiously attached, they often believe that the key to feeling safe lies in the other person's response. If they answer the text quickly, everything's fine. If they seem distant, something must be wrong. That need for reassurance can become so intense that it drives the anxious person to constantly reach for connection in moments of uncertainty. But what's rarely talked about is how this constant pursuit, while coming from a place of deep care and desire for closeness, can actually erode the very connection they're trying to protect. It's not because care is unattractive, It's because the energy behind that care becomes fear-based. And fear-based energy never creates safety. It creates pressure, intensity, and emotional urgency that can feel overwhelming to the person on the receiving end. When someone becomes the manager of their partner's emotional responsiveness, they lose their sense of groundedness. Their sense of peace becomes completely tethered to what another person does or doesn't do. And in that state, they're no longer connecting from a place of abundance. They're connecting from a place of emotional hunger. That hunger is what drives them to overgive, over-apologize, over-express. It's not that their love is too much. It's that they're asking the other person to fill a space that only they can fill themselves. The truth is, one of the most powerful things anyone can do in a relationship is to learn how to emotionally regulate, to calm their internal storm without needing someone else to fix it for them. That's self-soothing, and it's a skill, not a trait you either have or don't. It's something you build over time through awareness and repetition. When someone starts to self-soothe instead of chase, they begin to rewrite the story that anxiety has told them their whole life. They stop making someone else responsible for their sense of worth or security. They stop interpreting delayed responses or emotional withdrawal as evidence that they're unlovable. Instead, they learn to sit with discomfort without reacting. They learn to breathe through uncertainty. They develop an inner voice that says, "I might not know what's going on with them, but I know I'll be okay." That energy is deeply attractive, not because it's detached, but because it's anchored. And people are drawn to those who don't panic when they aren't immediately reassured. Avoidants in particular are sensitive to emotional pursuit. They often grew up equating closeness with pressure, or they learned early on that vulnerability could cost them their sense of freedom. So when they sense someone reaching out from a place of fear or need, they instinctively pull away. Not because they don't care, but because they feel emotionally unsafe. But when the anxious person shifts from needing to be reassured to knowing how to calm themselves, the energy between the two people changes. It softens, it becomes less charged, it invites the avoidant to come closer because they don't feel like they're being asked to rescue someone or be the sole provider of emotional safety. What makes this transformation so powerful is that the anxious person begins to realize they don't need to abandon their depth, their sensitivity, or their love in order to be attractive. They just need to learn how to hold their emotional experience with steadiness. When they can be in the middle of discomfort and not collapse into fear or overreaction, they become a source of emotional safety, not just for themselves, but for the relationship. They stop chasing because they're no longer running from their own anxiety. And that creates space for authenticity, for connection, for curiosity instead of control. When someone isn't trying to prove their worth, they start to live from it. And that quiet confidence is what changes the way people respond to them, especially those who are wired to keep distance. Because now they're not being asked to carry the weight of someone else's emotions. They're being invited into something calm, steady, and strong. When anxiety is transformed into self-worth, avoidants start to chase what they once feared. This shift doesn't happen by accident. It happens when the anxious person stops trying to manage the connection and starts managing their own internal state. The anxious attachment system is built on the belief that love must be earned, secured, chased, and preserved at all costs. That belief often leads to over-functioning in relationships, showing up too much, giving too much, thinking too much, all in hopes that the other person will finally feel safe enough to stay. But the problem is, the more anxious energy a person brings into the relationship, the more it triggers the avoidant's need for space. The avoidant partner doesn't respond to emotional intensity with gratitude. They respond with retreat, because deep down, that intensity reminds them of being emotionally overwhelmed, controlled, or smothered. Now imagine that same anxious energy is redirected, not repressed, not denied, but transformed. Instead of investing it all into securing someone else, it gets invested into anchoring the self. The anxious person begins to ask different questions, not how can I get them to stay, but how do I show up in a way that honors me, even if they don't? They stop chasing certainty in someone else and start creating inner certainty. That certainty is built through boundaries, consistency, self-awareness, and emotional resilience. It's the moment the anxious person realizes they can experience discomfort without reacting to it. They can feel doubt without needing to solve it immediately. They can be in the unknown and still trust themselves. When self-worth begins to grow, the anxious person no longer seeks closeness out of fear of abandonment. They begin to seek alignment. They no longer pour energy into people who meet them with confusion, inconsistency, or avoidance. They start recognizing that emotional safety isn't created through pursuit. It's created through clarity, mutuality, and presence. And the more they root themselves in this new standard, the more their energy shifts. They become less reactive and more grounded, less about needing to be chosen, more about choosing wisely. That shift is not subtle. It changes the entire emotional landscape of the relationship. For the avoidant, this change is deeply disorienting, but in a way that opens the door to deeper awareness. They are no longer being pursued, managed, or emotionally cared for in a way that enables their distance. Now, there is space. Space to feel, space to miss, space to question, space to desire. And what often happens is that the avoidant begins to realize they're no longer in control of the rhythm of the relationship. They're not being chased, they're not being pulled, they're not being coaxed back in with reassurance. The anxious person has stepped back, not in anger, but in self-respect. That absence creates a vacuum, and in that vacuum, the avoidant starts to feel the weight of what's missing. Where they once feared the closeness, they begin to feel drawn toward it, because now it's no longer threatening. The emotional pressure is gone, the neediness is gone. What's left is presence, strength, emotional maturity. And that is something that even the most avoidant person can feel safe enough to move toward. It's not that the anxious person became cold or distant. They became whole, and wholeness is magnetic. It doesn't need to prove itself. It doesn't try to convince anyone of its value. It simply is. When the anxious person reclaims their value, they stop reacting to every perceived threat to the relationship. They don't spiral when someone pulls back. They don't abandon themselves to keep someone interested. They know what they offer. They've stopped living in fear of losing someone and started living in awareness of what they deserve. That calm self-trust does something powerful. It invites the avoidant to move toward connection, not because they're being chased, but because they finally feel free enough to choose it on their own.